Hello there, folks. Tories and right-wing media hacks are leaping all over Ben Elton's takedown of Rishi Sunak on Laura Kuennsberg's BBC show. And this really goes to show what a bunch of whinging crybabies they are, especially when you take into account these are the same people who have two right-wing outlets in Talk TV and GB News to spout whatever crap they feel like, as you will see from what I'm about to show you. Let's start by pointing out the bleeding obvious for people who haven't been paying attention. There is a pro-Tory bias on the BBC. There always has been, and likely always will be. I believe the whinging from the people screaming there is a left-wing bias on the BBC stems from people who are so far to the right they can no longer differentiate between what is the left, what is the centre, and even what is the centre-right. Everything to the left of these morons they seem to treat as left-wing, because they're too damn vacuous for their own good. They will often harp on about a lack of balance, or a lack of right-wing representation on the BBC. Well, did you know, for example, between 2007 and 2019, Nigel Farage appeared in 1 in every 16 episodes of Question Time? He is also the only person I can recall in recent times that had an entire episode dedicated to himself, and that was in Peterborough in the run-up to the 2019 general election. So most level-headed people know the score over at the BBC. It's just the knuckle-draggers that seem not to. So we're going to have a look at some of them. But first, let's hear what Ben Elton had to say about his appearance on Laura Kuennsberg's show. He was on with Nick Ferrari on LBC the following morning. Let's take a look.
Now, before I let you go, Ben, I'll let you know you're back in the papers again today. It's almost like going back 30 or 40 years. The BBC accused of anti-conservative bias after Rishi Sunak was branded, quotes, as much of a mendacious, narcissistic sociopath as his previous boss on the flagship Sunday show. Comedian Ben Elton on Sunday with Laura Kuennsberg said the PM was dripping with vanity after watching Mr Sunak give an interview where he called on Britons to hold their nerve. A Tory source claimed producers have an anti-conservative bias. Tory MP Paul Bristow criticised the comic, saying you're a North London champagne socialist.
Oh, God.
Ben Elton.
They do love that, don't they? I was actually born in Catford, which is South East London, and we now live in Sussex. Gosh, honestly, don't they reach for this champagne? Oh, this elite, this media elite. Look, I didn't set out to mug the PM. I was really sad. I went on to plug my rail documentary. We scarcely had a chance to mention it because of the Russia thing. And they had this huge interview with the PM. And we sat through it. It was 20 minutes. And I really, really wanted to hear some proper commitment, some proper principle, and some actual new ideas. What I heard was a word salad of evasion and quarter truths and mendacity, and I got angry because I'm British, I live here. It's not about... I didn't set out to say it. If they hadn't played the interview, I wouldn't have said anything about him. She turned to me, she said, what do you think of that interview? And I thought what most people were thinking, which is, well, he literally didn't say anything except for the fact that I'm brilliant, I will sort everything out, and I have zero responsibility for the previous 13 years of Tory government. I was born 6 months ago when I became PM. And I'm sorry, it made me angry. I did not set out to have a go.
Was
and
it
the BBC
personal?
didn't...
Did you get personal?
Well,
Tories say you got a bit personal.
I didn't get it was personal from me. Look, he's the Prime Minister. I mean, I've had some slagging off in my time. And if that's the worst he gets, he should read some of my reviews. That is, honestly, I was giving a personal reaction as a Londoner and as a Briton who just made a documentary about our rail service. He was talking about our health service. You've just had a doctor on the line, etc. And the idea that there's no alternative than what they're offering... I'm sorry, it was a personal reaction. The BBC didn't know I was going to say it, but then I didn't know they were going to play that word salad and then ask me to comment on it.
By the way, this rail documentary he made was absolutely superb, so be sure to check it out on Channel 4's catch-up service. Ben Elton didn't need to explain himself here, but he did. And having done so, that should be the end of the matter. But no, of course not. So let's take in some of the utterly contemptuous snowflakery we have seen in response. So we will start with Boulevard. Probably pronouncing that wrong, but who gives a shit? Chief Executive of the Boris-backing grassroots group Conservative Democratic Organisation. She called the comedian, quote, a champagne socialist, unquote. Oh, how creative. And condemned the BBC. Quote, the BBC these days seems like one long party political broadcast for the Labour Party. It's becoming just a soapbox for the left, unquote. Miss Boulevard told The Independent. She also said it's a disgrace. Well, you're a disgrace. And I don't know how much more balanced you can get. Laura Kuennsberg interviewed the Prime Minister and barely pushed back against any of his drivel. And then Ben Elton responded to it with a minute-long rant. So 20 minutes interviewing the Prime Minister, in which he got a free ride, and then 1 minute of Ben Elton responding to that interview. And apparently this is just a soapbox for the left. Unbelievably dim. How dim can you be? The Conservative Post editor added, quote, the BBC isn't interested in hearing Conservative voices. The bloody Prime Minister was interviewed for 20 minutes. Pardon me. Sorry. Let me continue. Yet, of course, they allow a champagne socialist like Ben Elton all the time in the world to I'm sorry. It was 1 minute. It was 1 minute after a 20-minute interview with the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister. Right, we'll start again. The Conservative Post editor added, quote, the BBC isn't interested in hearing Conservative voices. Yet, of course, they allow a champagne socialist like Ben Elton all the time in the world to spout complete hate on live TV and then recommend viewers vote against the Tories. It's truly appalling. I'm all for free speech, but why should the British people be paying for that? It's not right. Oh boy. I need to calm myself. Ugh. Tory MP Steve Bryan said the BBC knew what they would get from the left-wing comedian, and it would be for licence fee payers to judge whether it was wise. Quote, I would think most people in the country are more interested in hearing from another Elton, unquote, he added, referring to Elton John's appearance at Glastonbury. And finally over here we have Sunak backing Tory MP Martin Vickers, adding, quote, Elton sounds even more out of touch with mainstream opinion than Keir Starmer, unquote. But I know what you're thinking, and it's, what are the good folk over at Talk TV and GB News saying about this? Well, let's go have a look. Right, so we're going to start out with the opinions of the very bizarre Kevin O'Sullivan and political columnist for The Sun, Trevor Kavanagh. Now, this is such an odd take. If you've seen the Sunak interview, it was awful. It was robotic. It was repetitive. It was horrible. Horrible. There was no responsibility and there was no plan. Just 5 pledges. Oh, the 5 pledges. Blah blah blah. I've only been here 6 months. Blah blah blah. Like it was horrible. One of the worst political interviews you'll ever see. The man's so boring and he's got no charisma and God. So this is an extraordinary take. Let's take a look.
That's the sort of thing you can say when you've got about 50 million quid in the bank. But he hasn't changed, has he? But that was an unfair allegation to make against Rishi Sunak based on that interview, which, as you wrote about, he was pretty straightforward and forthcoming about the mortgage crisis, what he plans to do, how he must get inflation down, and how he's not going to cave into every pay demand from the public sector.
Well, that's absolutely right. I thought it was actually quite a riveting interview. You saw a totally different Rishi Sunak. He was on the front foot. He was had his fists up. He was ready to fight and assert himself. And I think it was refreshing at last, long last actually, for him to show himself as he should do, as someone who's trying to lead the country in very, very difficult times, not all of which are to be laid at the feet of the Tory party or the Tory government, although some are. As for Ben Elton, I think that he had carefully rehearsed those preposterous allegations against Rishi's personally before he was put on air, and they knew he was going to say it. And I just think that he went so far over the top, he almost apologised later.
Yes, and of course, the BBC, being the BBC, didn't challenge him on these preposterous allegations. They should have said, from that interview, how did you deduce that he's a narcissistic sociopath? Because there's no way that anybody with half a brain could have drawn that conclusion from that chat. But nobody challenged him on that absolutely outrageous accusation.
Yes, I think that was, as I say, he had formed those words in his mind, this sort of verbal word salad. All of that was rehearsed stand-up comic routine. And he had nothing to justify it whatsoever. And I think actually it was grotesquely offensive to a person who for all the shortcomings of this Tory government, I do believe that basically Rishi Sunak is an honest person, and I think that he is doing what he thinks is right in the public interest. It may be different to what some people want. It may be not exactly the answer. Who knows? But to question his motivation in that way was ridiculous.
It was ridiculous.
I mean, this really is fantasy world stuff. They witnessed a completely different interview to the rest of us. They seem to think it was an overwhelmingly positive success, and not the repetitive, robotic, responsibility-shirking waste of time it clearly was. And then they throw out a conspiracy theory about Elton having pre-planned his monologue and being given the go-ahead to say it by the BBC. Dear God. Anyway, the only way is up from these two, right? Wrong. Yes, we have entered hell with the king of sanctimony over here, Dan Wooten, and the epitome of evil, Kelvin Mackenzie. Let's hear what they have to say. I'm sure it will be overwhelmingly positive about the BBC, won't it? Let's take a look.
I mean, Kelvin Mackenzie, this is extraordinary stuff. Remember, on the first episode of that show, they purposely hired the left-wing comedian Joe Lycett to humiliate the then Prime Minister Liz Truss. They secure an interview with Sunak. They then get another lefty to comedian in the form of Ben Elton to do just that. And there was no pushback, by the way. She didn't say, no. Where's your proof that Sunak is a sociopath?
I totally agree. Right, so Ben Elton, of course, had a long history. Those of us who are as old as I am, right, remember he made an entire career in the 80s attacking Thatcher on Channel 4. Right, but where's he been this last 20-odd years? 2 decades. He lives in Fremantle, Australia. He has an Australian passport. What on earth was he doing on there? And he hadn't just thought about this. He knew who was going to come on. He knew what the line of response by Rishi was going to be. So he thought up words like sociopath, mendacious, and narcissistic, right? And everybody, oh, yes, that's quite right. Actually, had that been Boris, for instance, I think everybody would say, yeah, that's what we find him attractive. Rishi is the opposite end of that. No, that Ben Elton thing, the Kuennsberg show hasn't been doing well. It hasn't been making headlines. So, strangely enough, the BBC will be pleased with this. What I object to is nobody took them to task about it. And secondly, I'm forced to pay for this crap. I'm forced to pay for Ben Elton to go on there. I have to have this as part of my package. And if I don't have it, I'm off to jail. It is a ridiculous circumstance. And thank God, GB News adds some bloody balance to it all.
What's Kuennsberg thinking? Because she's completely undermining her credibility as a so-called impartial presenter.
Well, I'm not sure there's much impartiality with Kuennsberg. I mean, after all, I can remember when Brown was in charge, she was virtually an unpaid PR when she was the political editor of the BBC. No, you cannot get preferment at the BBC if you are centre or centre-right. It's over. So you might as well do the opposite. But after all, it wasn't her decision to put Ben Elton on there. It was the editor or some two-pot producer.
She could say no.
She could say no.
And she also could have provided balance, and she didn't.
No.
And she didn't seek balance.
No, she didn't.
After what was a quite frankly unhinged attack.
But he didn't,
based on nothing, by the way.
He did.
Based on absolutely nothing.
No, he didn't.
I'm no fan of Sunak either, as you know.
He just look. He had planned all this in advance. He'd worked out the script. Right, it was almost like a headline. He knew what he was doing. And why doesn't he just bugger off back to Australia?
Yeah, that was 100% scripted.
It was.
I totally agree with you. It was a plan. Now, whether the BBC actually had insight into that plan, we don't know. But they must have had some idea of what he was going to do.
Well, that's what he was
after Joe Lycett.
Yeah, that's what he was doing on there. This wasn't a surprise. If he'd come at the end of it and said, you know, I quite like that guy, Rishi, compared to Boris or to Liv Truss, actually, I'm in favour of him. Yeah. That would have been a great thumbs down.
And by the way, we know why this is extraordinary, because following my show, there's this great show called Headliners, which features some lefty comics, but also some brilliant right-wing comedians who exist in this country. Whether they'd define themselves as that, I don't know. But, you know, the likes of Nick Dinson and Leo Kearse and Andrew Doyle. And I can bet you those folk would never be invited on to Laura Kuennsberg. And if they ever were, there would be absolute outrage over it.
There would. Yeah.
And this, of course, follows that atrocity of Question Time and Fiona Bruce on Thursday night, where she was just desperately looking out at the audience all the time saying,
that's true.
Find me a Brexiteer who hates Brexit.
That is true. But nevertheless, you must have been as surprised as I was at how the Brexit argument got a round of applause there. I wondered whether something had gone wrong with the BBC audience picker. I bet that person got fired afterwards.
Or maybe Brexit's just not as bad as the BBC like to think, Calvin Mackenzie.
Are they completely pissing stupid? It was a Question Time Brexit special with an audience comprised entirely of Brexiteers. Oh my God. Like, is there any truth uttered on this bloody channel? Oh my God. How many lies were just told in that 2.5 minutes? If you've got a centre or centre-right view, you're not welcome on the BBC. Are you crazy? Oh, what a bunch of whinging, crybaby, lying turds. Lies, ignorance, conspiracy theories, lack of brains. This is all they have. Ah, that's a good note on which to end. Well done, Ben Elton. If you've wound up these people, you're doing the right thing. And that's all that really matters. Take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you again soon.